Welcome to week 5 of the Mass Media and Politics class. The topics for this week is covering the relationship between the media and various institutions, ranging from the presidency and Congress to the courts, state government, local government, and foreign news coverage. And this is probably going to be the densest of the lectures, which makes it a very good thing that it's sort of sandwiched between two of the shorter lectures. So this is going to be relatively long, so you'll have to bear with me on this. So to start things off, we'll focus on the presidency and the media, as that's probably one of the most important political media relationships out there. And the relationship between these two is somewhat adversarial. So the media thrives on negative coverage and muckraking and that focus on controversy. But the media also wants to maintain access to government officials because, as we'll talk about in this chapter, in this lecture, government officials are a major source of news and information, provide a lot of information subsidies, essentially, to the media. So they want to be critical, but not so critical that the government shuts them out. On the other side, the government, of course, wants good media coverage. It wants the media to cover issues in a way to advance their political interest. So if the media is covering them positively, it'll probably be more open, more willing to work with it. And if it's covering them negatively, they're more likely to attack it and to try to block access. So they're highly dependent on one another for their own success, but they're also at odds with each other because of their goals. In general, media basically provides 4 jobs, 4 functions for politicians. So the first, like for you and me, the media informs people about current events. A lot of government officials will first learn about something or gain information on topics from media coverage of it. And more importantly, this also lets them get information about the behavior of other government officials. So if you're a member of Congress, you'll hear news reports about maybe what the other party is planning on doing in terms of policy, and you can react to that. So the media provides information to government elites just as it provides information to us. Second, the media helps keep them attuned to public concerns. Assuming that the media is reflecting public interest and public concerns, media coverage can give a signal to elites about what's considered important and what the public is worried about. So in the same way that the media can set the agenda for the public by focusing coverage on an issue, it can also set the agenda for members of government by focusing on an issue. Third, government officials can convey messages to the public through media by appearing on shows, by the media airing speeches, things like that. So the media serves as a way for government officials to message to the public, and then finally helps them remain in full public view. If you're interested in advancing along your political career, being accessible to the media is probably a good thing. So that's why, a lot of ambitious government officials might appear on the media a lot for interviews and serving as an expert opinion and just trying to maintain a public view, public coverage, so that when they run for maybe a higher office, they have better name recognition than their competitors. Out of all the branches of government, the media's relationship is probably strongest with the executive branch. And as a result, media coverage has also sort of tipped the balance of power towards the presidency in terms of the ability to influence the public. And there's a few reasons why. And a lot of that can probably be because it's just easier to cover the president. There's a single individual that all the media can sort of focus on. And we'll talk a bit more about some of this impact, particularly the media coverage can influence who becomes a candidate in the last week when we talk about campaigns and media. But media coverage can also influence policy outcomes. So if the media coverage on a policy is highly negative, it can deter politicians from focusing and passing that policy. And if media coverage is positive, that can serve as a sign of encouragement to continue to push for the policy. But a lot of the things that have weakened media influence overall also weakens the influence of the media on the executive branch. So fragmented and niche markets make it harder to get a sense of the public opinions. So if you turn to MSNBC, you're going to get a very different view of the country than if you turn to Fox News. And if you're a politician, it might be difficult to determine which sort of reality essentially you should be listening to. Second, the increase in entertainment choices. Again, most people, aren't tuned into politics 24/7. They're off watching entertainment. And so, again, the media can't influence you if you aren't watching it. So with more entertainment choices, less people are watching politics, the less the media can influence people's politics. The general negative tone of coverage. Again, it's kind of hard to get a signal through all the noise about what's really bad or what's really concerning when everything the media talks about is the worst thing that has ever happened, or it's highly negative. And as we've talked before, that negativity can cause distrust in the media, which lessens its impact. And then, partisan media and partisanship. Again, if the media is covering your party negatively, you're less likely to believe it than if they're covering your party positively or covering the other party negatively. So media impact is diminished by partisanship as well. Still, you can't really ignore the media. And there's two main ways that the media serves to transmit the messages of the president. The first is direct transmission. The media airs the speech with minimal interference. They can still influence it by how they frame it, by the shots, by the pre and post coverage and things like that. But otherwise, very minimal interference. So the State of the Union speech is probably a good example. Just they air the speech, the president speaks, and they got about almost an hour to say whatever they want directly to the American people. Then there is mediated transmission, which is where the message is mediated through the media. So say the White House releases a statement. The media then takes that statement and they spend several minutes discussing it on a panel show. Or the media takes a larger speech, breaks it up into sound bites and clips, and then talks about those clips and sound bites. Any sort of situation where the message is not directly transmitted, but it's transmitted through the media's sort of chopping it up and adding commentary. Such as in that example I have there in that picture of a post-State of the Union analysis being conducted by NBC News pundits. So the historical model of the relationship between the president and the media has sort of assumed a three-stage process. So the first is a honeymoon phase. So the president's been elected, and there's sort of like a post-election glow. They're just starting into office. They haven't passed anything yet, so they haven't had a period where they're trying to get their agenda passed, and then therefore the media can jump on the conflict and intrigue of political games. And the president trying to shore up their election, trying to shore up their influence and prestige, are more open to the media, trying to get their message out, trying to get the agenda started. And so during this period, the media coverage is usually more positive. But as the media has become more fragmented, more partisan, more negative in coverage, the honeymoon period has been declining. And in the case of Donald Trump's election, because Trump, routinely attacked media during the campaign, the media coverage of him was highly negative, you can basically argue that there was no such thing as a honeymoon period once Trump was elected. And this might become sort of the new norm or not. It depends. Again, Trump's very strong, blatant anti-media strategy hasn't quite... It's not that there's a lack of precedent, but it's never been to the level that Trump has done it. So whether this is a new normal or something more unique to the Trump administration, we'll have to wait and see. In a sense, then Trump sort of jumps straight to phase two, the sort of, I just dubbed it criticism stage to help with the PowerPoint. But it's basically the stage where the president is trying to get its agenda passed. And the government is in action, basically. And at that point, media coverage starts to become more negative because they have a conflict and controversy they can focus on. And so the media becomes more negative towards the presidency. And when the media starts going negative, you try to restrict access. So the government becomes more hostile towards the media and restricting access. So you can consider, for example, at the time of this recording, a common thing the Trump administration has started doing is banning people from recording and having video of press briefings. With one amusing result of that was CNN sent their sketch artist that they would normally send to the Supreme Court because the Supreme Court doesn't allow recording of arguments and all that. They sent their sketch artist to one of these press briefings to draw sketches of the briefing. So that's a very extreme example, but it's not. So that's a very extreme example, but that sort of tendency to try to restrict and limit the influence of the press becomes more common as the press sort of kicks into gear and starts covering the president more negatively. And then finally, finally, you got sort of a reconciliation stage where the president's starting to be concerned about re-election and the news is starting to shift towards horse race coverage. So the news coverage gets a bit more positive. The president, because they need the media to cover them more for re-election, starts opening up a bit more access. So the tone starts to sort of reach a new equilibrium where the media is a bit more positive and both sides are sort of moderating. Again, we'll have to see if that's what Trump does in 2020. My personal feelings are that no, he probably won't. It's the attack media strategy seems to have been successful for him so far. He's unlikely to stray from it. So, presidential communication strategy. So, if you're the president, what can you do to try and manage the messaging that's coming out of the media? So, first, you can try to win favor from the media, providing good stories for them, cultivating friendly relationships, but noting that access to government and the privileges you might get, like being able to go on Air Force One and things like that. Now, make it clear that those privileges and access are dependent on positive news coverage. And if the news coverage goes more negative, start restricting access, start taking away some of those privileges. Second, you can shape the flow of news. So let's say you're trying to distract from a bad story. The president might decide to release a whole bunch of news of events and executive orders and statements and whatever, something to sort of fill up the news time so they don't have a lot of time to focus on the thing that you're trying to distract them from. You might work on withholding competing news. So let's say you got something really big that you want to get out there. So you might shut off communication so that way there's nothing competing with the big announcement, the big policy push that you're trying to do. So that way the news doesn't get distracted by something else. And then finally, you can take advantage of the fact that because media has been losing resources, particularly state and local media, there's more of a shift towards soft news than hard news. And you can take advantage of that to sort of limit how much the media is investigating and looking at in-depth at things that you're doing, which, again, a lot of people concerned about news quality for political news, lack of in-depth media investigation on policy and governmental actions is kind of concerning. You can also work to orchestrate coverage. So, president says that they're going to hold a speech in the Rose Garden. That'll get news coverage. You can create events, rallies and speeches and whatever kind of event you want. If you're the president, very good chance the media will cover it. You can use media blackouts. So if you really want to sort of create suspense, if you want to, build up towards something, you can try to drastically limit how much information gets out to the media. You can use public ceremonies. So the president is the first pitch of the baseball game, the baseball season. I forget exactly how that works because I'm not a big sports person, but stuff like that. Stuff where there's a ceremony attached to it and the president, attends. So say the president gets invited to do a commencement speech at a university or something. I don't know. And then finally, you got direct messaging. So the presidential websites, electronic communications, email list, social media and apps. We'll talk a bit more about those in the campaigns and elections, but technology has prevented many opportunities for people to directly message constituents through websites, email, social media, apps, things that allow them to directly message to supporters and get around the media. So what are some different forms of contact between the media and the presidency? So press releases, just official statements sent out by the White House. Pretty easy. News briefing and news conferences. So I think he's no longer doing them at this point, but he had Sean Spicer who would do the news briefing. So you'd have the spokesperson for the president essentially standing at a lectern, and you'd have all the news journalists there, and they would ask questions. The person would respond, things like that. And at these conferences, the goal for the president's spokesperson is to try and control the questioning. So you have prepared answers and statements for questions that you expect to happen. You try to choose friendly media. So one criticism of Spicer has been tendency to choose conservative media outlets and to give interviews to conservative media outlets but not other outlets. Avoid follow-up questions, which is why one piece of advice a lot of people keep trying to give to journalists at these news briefings is to ask only one question, because if you ask multiple parts of a question, they'll tend to pick the part of the question that they can answer with the most positive response and kind of ignore the rest of the question. So you can have backgrounders, which are off-the-record meetings. So these would be, the sort of things where a government source talks to a journalist off the record, and the journalist can take that information and not name the source, but they can use that in the story. So basically, anytime you see something where it's a government official, government staffer, undisclosed, unnamed, whatever, that was probably the result of a backgrounder. Somebody talked with the journalist off the record. They didn't want their name attached to it for various reasons, but it served as a start of a news story. Then you have more explicit on-the-record interviews, and then you have leaks. So anonymous sources send documents or information to the journalist, who then publish that information or use it to do it. Sometimes these leaks are on purpose, so let's say you want to float an idea but want to see what media coverage of it would be like. You might leak a policy report or a memo or something, see how it goes, and if depending on media coverage, decide what you're going to do. And then, of course, you got a lot of the unofficial leaks that oftentimes can be embarrassing or detrimental to an administration if it paints the administration in a negative light. Those obviously less controlled. So I have here a press briefing example from White House YouTube channel. And at the time of this recording, I had gotten this off of June 12th. So it's going to be a little out of date by the time you see this, but it's just an example. You don't have to watch the whole thing. Just watch a little bit of it. Or if you want, you can go look up a more up-to-date briefing. Doesn't matter. Point is, just wanted to give an example of the briefing. Now that we've covered the presidency, we can focus on another branch of government, which is Congress. Now, in terms of coverage, Congress as a whole, if you include a lot of the stuff about policymaking, gets about equal coverage to the presidency. But individual members of Congress don't get as much attention. Some exceptions to that is those in prominent leadership positions get more attention. So Speaker of the House, majority leaders, minority leaders, people in a position of power and influence get more attention. Senior members get more attention than their junior members. So if you've been in Congress for a long time, you'll probably get more attention. So John McCain, Lindsey Graham, they've been in for a long time. They get more attention than, say, someone who just got elected or something. The fact that I can't name anyone off the top of the head is a sign of how little attention they can get. And senators usually get more attention than members of the House. Members of the House represent a small district. Senator represents a whole state. So there's a bit more prestige attached to the senator than representative. Reasons why Congress is more difficult to cover than the presidency come down to a few main things. So the president, like I said, you have a very singular focus. You have one individual that the media can focus on and create a narrative about. But Congress, there's 535 members of them, 100 senators, 435 representatives. It's very hard to craft a narrative and to focus on such a large body of people. Second, members of Congress aren't as dependent on national coverage. They don't have to run a national election. The president needs the attention of the whole country, especially because when they run for re-election, they have to compete nationwide. If you're a member of the House of Representatives, so if you're, say, Lee Zeldin, the representative of New York 1st District, you only need to make sure that the people in your district know who you are. You don't care if the people in Alaska know who you are. So you're less dependent. Same goes for senators. They only need to really care that the people in their state know who they are. Again, unless you're somebody who's got maybe larger ambitions, then you might want more national attention to sort of fuel your ambition. But otherwise, you're not dependent on national media. And then finally, a lot of the work of Congress is highly technical. It's drafting legislation. Best way to put it is, have you ever watched C-SPAN? C-SPAN is boring. The presidency has more of a feel of action to them because, one, they do have a lot of power that allows them to act independently of Congress. They can focus on broad policy statements instead of all the minuscule technical details. So it's just the presidency feels more active and interesting than Congress. And there's less work you have to do to focus on it. You just have to cover what the president's doing instead of trying to figure out how to frame the actions of a collective body. And so coverage of the presidency is a bit more dramatic and interesting than coverage of Congress. And so that's where you'll see a lot of the differences in the coverage between them. Now, I've already kind of spoiled this a little bit, but just to give an example, most of you probably recognize the first person, Donald Trump. The question is, how many of you recognize the other three? Sort of go ahead and spoil it here. Again, Donald Trump. If you don't know him, that's kind of concerning, but he gets the most news coverage, and he was already pretty famous before being president. So lots of news coverage, he's the president. Next, you have the Chuck Schumer, who is a senator from New York, and he's the minority leader. So he's in charge of the Democrats in the Senate. So he might get more attention than other senators. You then have Kirsten Gillibrand, who is the other senator from New York, who might get more coverage in state, if you're talking state media, but maybe not as much national, though this might be a bit of an exception since her name has been thrown about before for possible 2020 Democratic presidential nominee. So in that sense, she might get more attention than other senators, but that's more of an exception than the rule. And then finally, Lee Zeldin from New York, 1st District. Probably won't get a lot of national coverage, but you might see him in your local news, or maybe the more regional, general Long Island sort of news. But you're probably not going to see him mentioned too much on the national stage. Now, the relationship between members of Congress and the press is still kind of adversarial, but it's a more cautious relationship. Part of it is because in the same way that the media is less dependent on, or in the same way that members of Congress are less dependent on the media is less dependent on the member of Congress. The fact that Congress is a larger body means that journalists are more free to sort of cover a member of Congress more negatively, because even if that member of Congress blocks them, they can go to another member. There's 535 people. They can afford to, make a few of them mad. And members of Congress don't necessarily mind getting the national media figures mad at them because they're more concerned about state and local media. But, again, it's not a perfectly independent relationship. If you want attention, national media in particular is still probably the best source. If you're concerned, say you're a senator or representative and you have a really important issue, getting national attention might help you push a policy. And if you're ambitious, you definitely want national attention. Second, the media serves as a check for the executive branch. If you're a member of Congress, the media is a good way to get information about the executive branch. And the media's coverage of the executive branch compared to Congress can serve as a way to limit the executive branch. So if you're Congress and you think the presidency's gone too far on something, you can send out members of your party to the national media to criticize the president and hope that negative coverage will influence public opinion in a way to limit the executive branch's behaviors. Members of Congress, again, are concerned about local media, so local media serves as a primary way for them to communicate with their district. And for media in general, talking with members of Congress brings a sort of human interest aspect. So you can just talk with them, get a sense about their person, and then you can bring in their quotes and maybe some of their backstory into a story about a policy to make it a bit more interesting. And their insider comments do serve as a way to get information on maybe behind the scenes development of policy. And then finally, congressional investigations are a source of stories. So if Congress is investigating something and they're holding hearings, that's a source of stories. So Congress, a bit more cautious, a bit more independent from the media, but there's still a lot of back and forth between them, and there's still a lot of advantages maintaining a good relationship. But like the presidency, the digital age has offered new ways for members of Congress to get their message out. So both the House and Senate have a website for the chamber. You can go to it and get information on the House and the Senate, who's on the committees, things like that. And then members of Congress usually have websites as well. And sometimes you'll see where they have an official government website, and then they'll have a campaign website. So, for example, if you go to Chuck Schumer's website, you can see his media section, and you'll see a whole bunch of information on money he's brought to New York State and policies he's worked to pass to favor New York State. You go to Paul Ryan's website, you'll see a lot more information on sort of the broader Republican agenda, since he's the Speaker of the House and therefore nominally in charge of the Republican Party in the House. Congressional records and legislation are available online. It used to be at the Thomas database, but now I think it's just congress.gov. So if you want to see the text of a bill in development, you can go onto the website and get that information. And then finally, C-SPAN Video Library records the meetings of Congress. So if you want to see the records of a hearing, you can go to C-SPAN. And this technology has also allowed for new ways to contact members of Congress through email. But the amount of mail and the fact that it's hard to get an idea of where that email came from means a lot of it doesn't get looked at, and just it's too much for staffers to organize. And social media is another way to contact, but it's hard to coordinate messages across different media. And so these new ways give ways to contact members of Congress, but in many aspects, traditional methods are still probably more effective. So calling them, sending a physical letter, something I've seen interviews with staffers basically say it feels like you've put more effort into it if you do a handwritten letter or if you call, and they keep track of that information as well. And in other words, they keep better track of phone calls and letters. And physical letters can also provide a prop for members of Congress. So those traditional methods might still be more effective ways of communicating to Congress than the new media. But a new media at least offers opportunities. So we're going to shift gears again. We're going to talk about the media and the judicial system. So the judicial branch is the least covered of the three branches of government. So the president's the most covered. Congress as a whole is covered just as much as the presidency. Individual members get less attention. Judiciary, the least amount of attention. You might get some state and local media coverage of judicial elections. So some states, judges are elected, and you might get some media focus on that. Confirmation of Supreme Court hearings, such as Neil Gorsuch, which is that picture right there, that will get attention. And the U.S. Supreme Court will get attention during the period in which there's arguments and the releasing of opinions. But otherwise, outside of those areas, you don't get a lot of attention on the courts. Again, unless there's like some major thing. So, like, say the lower court rulings on Trump's travel ban got media attention because it was a conflict between the presidency and the judicial branch, essentially. So that will get attention. But the normal everyday rulings that those courts do don't get as much attention. And some of the challenges of covering the court you can see when looking at the Supreme Court. So one thing is that multiple decisions are released at once. The court doesn't just release one opinion, even within one case. So within one case, you can have several different opinions. You can have the majority opinion, concurring opinion, dissenting opinion, and then they have multiple opinions in a day. So like 5 or 6 opinions with multiple opinions. That's a lot of information to take at once. And most news don't have skilled legal experts to analyze the meaning right then and there. And the court's press office doesn't usually try to help because there's concerns about interpretation. So in other words, the press office of the Supreme Court is concerned about interpreting the meaning because they don't want to get in trouble for interpreting something wrong or make it seem like they're supposed to be making statements about the meaning. In other words, the court's press office is concerned about becoming like another court. Furthermore, the Supreme Court bans reporters from deliberations. In other words, the court allows reporters in for the arguments. Reporters sit out and wait on the decisions, but the actual act of writing the opinions, the deliberation on the votes, who's going to write the opinions, reporters aren't involved in that process. That's purely private and secret. Television cameras are usually barred from federal courts, so you cannot bring a television camera to the Supreme Court at all. And members of the court themselves are usually highly protective of the prestige and the opinion of the court, so they usually try to minimize access. So they might go to, say, a judicial law review, they might go to maybe a more academic setting, but they usually don't give a lot of press. They don't deal with the press a whole lot. I mean, you can think, for example, Ruth Bader Ginsburg got in trouble during the election for making negative comments about Trump, with some people saying she should recuse herself from certain cases. So that's the sort of thing that they might be concerned about. And so I have here a video dealing with the court's ruling on California Proposition 8, which was regarding gay marriage. And it starts with what's called the running of the interns, which is sort of a joke phrase describing the interns for the news who have to sit outside and wait on the courts, grab the opinion, and then run as fast as they can to their news person so their station can be the first to report on it. So I'll pause here for a bit to play the clip and then return to the lecture.
Bill, stand by. We want to go back now to the Supreme Court. You see some of the interns running out with the decisions. Jan Crawford has more information. Jan, what have you learned?
Well, Nora, what you see now, this is how we find out when these decisions come down. All of the interns, here comes our intern now with the decision. The court has just handed down its ruling in the California Proposition 8 case. Here it is. Let's take a look at it. Held. Petitioners did not have standing to appeal the district court's order. Chief Justice John Roberts delivers the opinion of the court in which Scalia, Ginsburg, Breyer, and Kagan joined. Very unusual lineup there, which of course we're going to get into in just a moment. But what that means, and I can tell you what this means right now, if they're upholding the decision, if the decision of the district court stands, because the court has no jurisdiction in this case, that means that Proposition 8 is struck down. The California Supreme Court ruling will remain the law, and same-sex marriages in the state of California, and people are going to argue about this. You will definitely hear back and forth procedurally about how this happens, but it is most likely that same-sex marriage in the state of California will resume.
So, what is some of the impact of how the news covers the court? Well, the first is the Supreme Court usually has better approval ratings than the presidency or Congress. Again, that has diminished as polarization and partisanship has risen, but it's still generally seen in a better light than the presidency or Congress, which usually gets a lot more coverage and a lot more negative coverage. But when the Supreme Court or the judicial system as a whole does get coverage, it usually does hurt the public's rating of it. Because again, so the news covers a controversial Supreme Court. It's going to talk about the politics of the decision, and talking about politics in the context of the Supreme Court tends to hurt public perception of it. And there is some concerns that public opinion may hurt, there is concerns that public opinion could influence rulings. So some judges may be concerned about establishing a legacy, a positive legacy. They want history to remember them positively. So they'll try to maybe do rulings that they think are going to be good policy and be remembered. They're concerned about the public perception of the court and the legitimacy of the court. So, for example, some have argued that Trump's attacks against the judiciary system in response to his travel bans, in response to the injunctions placed on his travel bans. In other words, he loses in court, he says negative things about the courts. That has led some to speculate the courts might be more critical of Trump than they would other presidents because of wanting to maintain a sense of judicial independence. In other words, if Trump threatens the court system by talking about how terrible they are, how the Ninth District Court should be broken up, things like that, that the judicial system might sort of fight back by being more stringent and more critical of him and his administration's arguments than they would be in order to maintain a sense of independency, to sort of say, no, we aren't going to back down to your threats. And so that will make it more difficult for the Trump administration to get victories at the court. So that could be one way of how public opinion can influence the court's behavior. What does get a bit more attention than the Supreme Court and the judiciary system is the criminal justice system. Most news are about the crime is probably the biggest thing that news talks about. About 1/3 of news coverage, especially local news coverage, deals with crime. But as I talked about with the agenda setting stuff a few weeks ago, a lot of the focus is on violent crime, which again, you have that perception of crime always being worse than it really is. And there's not a lot of emphasis on white-collar crime. So you can think of, for example, like fraud, crime that you might associate with like a banker or a accountant, which is usually a lot more common than violent crime, and oftentimes has maybe greater national impact than violent crime, but it gets a lot less attention. Because of this, there's a lot of concerns about how media covers crime and how that might distort policy. So I've already talked about how the sensationalism and the focus on violent crime leads to public to perceive crime to always be worse than it really is, usually at very high levels. So that might push for people to favor more stringent criminal justice procedures, lack of discussion of causes of crime, and policies that might alleviate it. So if, say, you're someone who believes that a lot of crime is a result of low income and poverty pushing people to desperation, you might be annoyed by the media talking about the violent crime committed by, say, low-income people, or, let's say, the mentally ill, but not a lot of talk about why that mentally ill person or those people were in low-income areas to begin with, and policies that might help alleviate, poverty, or to help mentally ill individuals so they're not in a position to where they're going to be committing crime. Public attention on a case might encourage prosecutors to go for harsher sentences. So if the public is invested in a criminal trial, prosecutors might try for a stronger sentence. And then finally, and this is one of those topics where if this was a full semester course, I would probably go in more in depth. A lot of the focus on coverage of crime focuses on crime committed by minorities, particularly African American men and Hispanics. And this can lead to a perception of African Americans as, and there's been research that has looked at people's associations of African Americans, to perceive them as more violent, to perceive them as less innocent. So as I think at the time of this recording, Associated Press was publishing a new study that had showed people perceived African American girls as less innocent and less needed protection than girls of other races. Similar studies have shown similar attitudes towards African American males. So you could take an African American child, essentially, and people will perceive them as more violent, more criminal, less need of protection, less innocent, perceived as being more of an adult than they really are. And research has sort of linked this to coverage of crime that overemphasizes minorities and crimes committed by minorities. So that's some of the biggest challenges of how media covers crime. And it's a topic I would go more in depth of if this was a full semester course. Unfortunately, we don't have the time to really investigate that issue. So moving on from the branches of government, we can look at the levels of government and state and local news. And the most watched form of news is local news. Your, evening broadcast, for example. But local and state news have been some of the hardest hit by the decline in resources. So this has actually, for example, impacted polling. A lot of polls at the state level are done by state newspapers. But because state media have been losing resources as people turn to other sources of information or entertainment, polling has happened less often, and the quality of the polling has sort of worsened. And that might be, for example, part of why polls at the state level were off in the 2016 election. National polls, on the other hand, since they have more resources, national polls were relatively accurate in terms of the two-party vote share. One thing that can make it a bit difficult for state and local news is that there is a difference in the boundaries of the media markets versus the political communities. So, for example, my hometown of Estill Springs, Tennessee, is close enough to the Huntsville border that for a period of time, our cable television came out of Huntsville, Alabama. So when Huntsville had campaigns for local and state offices, we would get Alabama state campaign ads, even though we live in Tennessee. Similar areas, more close to home, for most of you probably know in the Stony Brook community, New Jersey is close enough that there are parts of Pennsylvania and New York and parts of New Jersey who get information from New York, similar sort of area. So the political boundaries and the media markets aren't the same. And so that pushes towards more general interest. So again, you don't have us living in southern Tennessee, in my case, getting information unique only to Huntsville. Not so much of an issue now, we've changed cable, but that would be sort of the thing. So you push towards general interest, so you don't have to worry that your market is accidentally giving coverage to things that people don't care about because they don't live in the political community. But one thing that might be good is that there has been more of a demand for local and state news. And so there's been more of coverage of local and state by more traditional media, and new outlets have started to sort of appear to try to fill in the gap. So one way this sort of gets organized is this umbrella competition pattern. So you might have the Metro News that covers international, national, and regional news. So you have like the major paper. So you can think like within the New York area. You got the New York Times that covers the national and international news, even if it's nominally coming out of New York. But then you have smaller, more regional papers and media sources that cover more local news. And then you have maybe within your suburb a local news. And then you got like a weekly newspaper and shopper. But those are mostly advertisements. So at the time of this recording, I'm out of state visiting my family here in Tennessee. You have the Tennessean, which is sort of the big state paper that covers, national and state news. And then you got a Tullahoma newspaper, which covers Tullahoma and the surrounding areas. So that's the local. And then every week we get, I forget what it's called, but it's all advertisements. 3 levels of newspapers of increasing focus, from national and international news and state news to the local area news to newspaper advertisements. These smaller satellites, though, because they have less resources, are usually less in depth than the more higher up the chain, essentially. So that local Tullahoma newspaper probably has less in-depth stories than the Tennessean, which might have less in-depth stories than the New York Times or the Washington Post. Alternative press sources, however, have also sort of risen. So outside of that sort of pattern, you have a lot of race or ethnic newspapers. So newspapers specifically dedicated to certain religious or race and ethnic communities. An example there, not quite a small local thing, but a national news station, is Univision, which is a Spanish television network that is on par with the top English networks. So it's a national news network just as good as any of the others. And in fact, some political scientists have argued that if you're interested in polling on Hispanic community in the United States, Univision polls are more useful than polls by, say, the Washington Post or New York Times that are national, in which Hispanics are a subset, versus Univision polls, which often are exclusively centered on getting the opinion of Hispanic communities. You have minority political cultures, so your textbook talks about, for example, magazines dedicated towards lesbian gay communities within, say, San Francisco. Another example, every time I've gone to Columbia University for a conference, there's usually somebody standing outside the entrance selling newspapers for a socialist organization, newspapers for alternative lifestyles. So outside of the mainstream media, you might get more press that is dedicated and geared towards specific interests or communities. And those papers may be very in-depth on the issues they're concerned about. But since they're dedicated towards that sort of more niche market, anything outside of that, people might be less informed about. So you might be very well informed about the things talked about in those more specified niche magazines or newspapers, but things outside of that you might be less informed about. That's probably not as much of an issue for Univision, but that might be more concern for, say, that person standing outside Columbia University selling a socialist newspaper. At the local level, the relationship between the press and local government is probably less formal than it is at higher levels. Basically, when everybody sort of lives in the same town, it's easier for the press and government officials to sort of hang out and work with each other without formal channels, without needing to do press briefings and set up a department for media communications. You can just go meet them at bar or talk with each other at the football game or something like that. Everybody lives in the same town, much easier to sort of meet with each other and work with each other. So there's less need of formal channels. One result of this, though, is that individuals at the local level are usually not as good at dealing with the media as people sort of higher up the chain. The press materials released by local government officials tend to be of lesser quality, and the media at the local level has more of difficulty covering stuff because the things that mayors do are usually a lot more technical. Your local town mayor is probably not doing major sweeping policy statements with grand visions of the country. They're working on, sewer lines and potholes and more technical, detailed work that, because the local news usually isn't as formally trained or has specialists, it's a bit more difficult to cover. They have less formal education and training. There's higher turnover rate. You often have non-competition clauses where, so say, for example, I worked for Tullahoma's newspaper. and I left, I might have a clause in my contract that says I can't work for any other newspaper in Tullahoma. So I have to go do a newspaper in, say, Chattanooga, which is another city near where Tullahoma is. I don't live in Chattanooga, so I can't really write as well about Chattanooga as, say, someone who did live there. But because I could write better about Tullahoma because that's closer to where I live and I'm familiar with the area, but I can't because of the non-competition clause. And smaller media, less resources, so more dependent on government for information and more likely to engage in pack journalism where they just follow the stories of the larger outlets. So Phyllis Candice has media styles that discuss different ways that local government officials sort of interact. You have the paranoid media avoider, so a local government official who just won't deal with the media whatsoever and might retaliate against negative coverage. The naive professional who probably talks with the media too much and doesn't make an effort to restrain themselves so they could lose control of a story. The ribbon cutter who focuses mostly on trivial events to get attention, so they'll show up to every news store and every new opening of something to get attention, but relatively trivial. The dancing marionette, they sort of spend most of their time reacting to news coverage instead of creating news coverage, highly sensitive to the news coverage of themselves. The colorful quotable, so someone that just creates good sound bites so the media likes to go to them to get sound bites that sound good, but again, maybe don't have a lot of depth to them. And then just liars who conceal or slant information to try and create favorable coverage. You can also probably apply this to larger levels of media individuals. So the content of news. So national news usually doesn't focus on state news that much, except for a few major states. And if you're talking election coverage, focus mostly on swing states and maybe the first few states of the primary. So please pray for the poor people of Iowa and New Hampshire every time a presidential election come around, because those poor people are basically living in a media madhouse. State news, so state news talking about state news. There's not a lot of outlets that specialize in state news, and a lot of the news focuses on major metro areas. So, for example, watching the local news here in Tennessee, I know quite a bit about what goes on in Nashville. No idea what's going around Estill Springs or Tullahoma, though. Local news doesn't focus on them too much. The news on politics is less. In most states, members of the state legislature work part-time, so they have much shorter sessions, so there's less politics going around. And the daily papers usually don't have someone assigned to focus on politics. It's just basically they report on politics when something big happens, but there's nobody dedicated to it. So you have less political news overall. And then your local news, weather, crime, human interest stories. That's most of your local news. Not a lot of focus on politics. And when there is, it's very rarely focused on policy. But your local newspaper might be endorsing candidates, and at the local level, endorsements can be very influential because people have less ways of getting information about local candidates compared to, say, the national level, where you can find out about the presidential candidates pretty easily. So newspaper endorsements can be much more influential at the local level. Finally, foreign affairs coverage. American news generally cares more about the United States. Foreign events only get focused on to the extent that the news involves the United States. So the more the United States is involved in a foreign affair, the more likely it is to get coverage. So if it doesn't have a direct impact, or it's not some huge event that can't be ignored, it probably won't get covered. Historically, a lot of major news outlets would have foreign news bureaus to report on foreign news. That's not the case anymore. The Associated Press is the largest source of international news in the United States, and with the exception of the New York Times and CNN, there really aren't any more permanent international news bureaus. So most news does not have someone permanently stationed in London or Paris, or I don't know if they've ever had anyone in Beijing, but you get the idea. So the main sources of foreign news, you don't really have the traditional U.S. foreign correspondent. You might have somebody who's called that. But the more likely thing is they'll hire someone from the area to serve as a correspondent. And you might have, and those are usually cheaper as well. And then you might have premium correspondents where corporations, such as, say, Bloomberg News, will pay to have correspondents. And then the traditional news media might work with those correspondents. You can have parachute journalists. So basically, take someone often with very little expertise or knowledge about the area and just sort of drop them off there and say, okay, report on what's going on. So you can think of situations where the news sends someone to cover an event so you can imagine a traditional news outlet sending someone to London to cover the Brexit vote or the London Prime Minister elections. And that person might not have a lot of knowledge about England or the system, so they just kind of report the basic facts as they're told, but not maybe offer a lot of commentary or anything like that. So just send somebody over there, send anyone over there. A lot of times, not a lot of experience. A lot of it, and the lack of permanent international news agencies means that news is very dependent on foreign governments. So public relations and tourism boards, foreign news agency. So public relations and tourism boards from the government might provide information. Foreign news outlets are another very common source. So a foreign news outlet reports on something, and the U.S. media might pick it up and report based on what the foreign news outlet said. And then finally, citizen journalists. Citizens in foreign countries report news or record videos of events, and then the U.S. media picks it up. One of the more controversial ways of covering foreign news, especially war coverage, has been this embedded journalism. So after the Vietnam War, the U.S. government, which was concerned that media coverage of the war had been a major part of why people sort of reacted negatively towards it, was concerned that too much news coverage, too much negative coverage could dissuade support for military intervention. And so one solution has been this embedded journalism, where journalists are trained to sort of be embedded within a military unit and to report on that unit. So we have, for example, here Bob Woodruff of ABC News, who was embedded with the U.S. 4th Infantry Division in Iraq until he was injured in an attack in 2006. And one of the concerns about this is that this training and being embedded with the military might cause problems with objectivity, so the news might be slanted in a pro-military way and focus on the U.S. perspective of the war, but might not be objective and analyze the situation and report on, say, the other side's perspective. So say if you're someone who's concerned about civilian casualties in U.S. Middle Eastern policy, embedded journalists might, because of their relationship with the people involved, might be more hesitant to report about civilian casualties or downplay U.S. involvement or, something to try to maybe take some of the pressure off. And most people who've looked at it seem to suggest that maybe objectivity isn't as... The reporter's not being objective, maybe not as much of an issue, but the limited perspective... Because basically you're getting the perspective of being a U.S. soldier within that unit, but you're not really getting any other perspective. And if the goal is to get full coverage of a war, having a limited perspective may not be the best thing to have. So embedded journalism gives access to war coverage, on-the-ground war coverage that they might not be able to get normally. But there is concerns about how limiting it might be in terms of what perspectives get offered about the war. Outside of war coverage, go back towards the beat. While there aren't a lot of permanent beats, when there are correspondents sent out or dealing with news bureaus, most of the focus is on capital cities. And so, similar to sort of the state level issue, you'll get a lot of information about what goes on in the capital of foreign nations, or news as filtered through what comes through the capital. But you won't get the perspective of areas outside the capitals as much. And the majority of foreign affair news comes through Washington, D.C., through, say, government agencies and such. So again, you still have another way of which the perspective gets limited, because it's mostly going through more formal channels, of which the people involved in those formal channels might have certain objectives to try to paint coverage in a way to advance, say, U.S. interest in an area. And then finally, a lot of the focus, your routine focus is going to be on countries with major diplomatic or military connections to the United States. So Middle East, Western Europe, and Russia probably dominate foreign news coverage in the United States. If we talk about Asia, you might hear about China, Korea, and Japan. Occasionally India. Otherwise, you're basically not going to hear anything. If we talk about the Western Hemisphere, might talk about Mexico or Canada, our immediate neighbors. South America basically never gets talked about, except maybe in relation to drug cartels or something like that. Again, this is not to say it never gets covered, but it very rarely gets covered outside of these sort of major areas. So what are some of the pressures that you see? And a lot of the pressures are very similar to the pressures on domestic news. So first off, you got cultural pressures. So the stories are told in a way that reflects U.S. values and often focuses on stereotypes of those foreign nations. So a big area of which this is usually criticized, your book sort of terms pornographic barbarism, is particularly coverage of, say, third world countries. The coverage tends to focus on maybe some of the poorest, least developed aspects of those countries, areas where there's disaster and conflict. That paints a very sort of horrific element of those countries, but ignores maybe the more developed part, more higher income. And it's not to say that means you should ignore, but it paints a very different picture and tends to stereotype those regions as sort of these backwards, underdeveloped places that are just falling apart, instead of getting a full picture of what that country is like. You can have political pressures. So obviously the host government wants foreign media outlets to provide good coverage. So remember a few weeks back on the authoritarian control, Venezuela government, Venezuela-controlled media was banning CNN and trying to get foreign news coverage to paint Venezuela as not being under a huge protest movement at the time. So your foreign media is your experience as a foreign media in a foreign country is going to be influenced by how much the foreign government tolerates you. If they believe that your coverage is hurting their country in some way, they're likely to put more hurdles in your path and to maybe block you or highly restrict your access. Or at the most extreme, maybe use the threat of imprisonment or violence against you. But your home country can also cause problems with bureaucratic hurdles. Foreign country can do that too. So political pressures can greatly limit access and journalistic coverage of countries that maybe are trying to limit foreign news from reporting on the events in their country, or whether to maintain good impressions abroad, or to maybe prevent domestic news from picking up coverage from foreign news of the country. You have media diplomacy. So again, a lot of the reason these countries might want to restrict media is because of concerns about how much influence the media could have on public opinion. So foreign leaders might use media to circumvent normal diplomacy. So for example, Megyn Kelly's interview with Putin, instead of directly dealing with the United States government leaders, Putin has an interview with Megyn Kelly, talks about Russia's positions on issues to deny Russian involvement in interference in the 2016 election, and uses the interview to send messages about Russian diplomatic stances, hopefully for government elites to sort of pay attention to. And sometimes journalists might directly get involved in the political process. Maybe not as much of a thing now, but your book talks, for example, where journalists were involved with negotiations between countries and things like that. And then, of course, your usual economic pressures. So foreign news coverage tends to decline during eras of bad economic times. So you can think, for example, in the United States, the Iraq War was a major news item until the recession hit in 2008, 2009. And since then, the Iraq War and Afghanistan are not very common news items you'll see, despite U.S. involvement in those areas still. And just generally speaking, foreign news is much harder to get on American news compared to domestic news. The bar is higher in terms of how conflict, dramatic, intriguing, just how interesting the story is a much higher bar if it's a foreign news because of the difficulty of getting Americans to pay attention to foreign news. And to sort of give you a sense of that, sociologist Herbert Gons has a list, sort of from top to bottom, of what gets covered from the most in U.S. news to the least covered. So U.S. activities in a foreign country. So say the presidential visit to a foreign country, U.S. war in a foreign country, anything where the U.S. is directly involved gets the most attention. Second, events that affect Americans directly. So say OPEC declares an increase in oil prices. That'll affect Americans directly through gas. That will get attention. Relations with purely hostile states. So Russia, North Korea, Syria, those get a lot more attention than states that maybe we're friendlier or neutral with. Government upheavals and leadership change, usually of allies. So Americans, we hear a lot of news on, say, the French and British elections. Don't usually hear about government changes of other countries. Dramatic political conflicts, so civil war breaks out in a foreign country over the new leadership. We might hear about that. disasters, major tsunamis, earthquakes, the partial meltdowns of nuclear power plants in Japan, things like that might get attention. And then finally, the excesses of foreign dictators. So foreign dictator does something particularly excessive or weird or news-grabbing, you might hear about that. So from most U.S. involvement to least U.S. involvement. Generally, the more the U.S. is involved, the more likely it is you'll hear news about it. So what are some of the impacts that foreign affair coverage can have based on what we said? Generally, news coverage, because it's so reliant on government information in a lot of cases, is generally supportive of the status quo of foreign affairs. So basically, if a country is perceived as an enemy of the United States by the administration, news coverage tends to paint it in a negative light, while countries that are perceived as friends to the United States tend to be perceived as friends and more positive light. We talked about stereotyping, so developing countries in particular are usually very heavily stereotyped as backwards, undeveloped, constant poverty, crime, a lot of reliance on stereotypes. And the media is often willing to collaborate on restricting coverage. You can think of, for example, say the US government doesn't want the media to cover the planes transporting coffins of US military soldiers. Oftentimes, the media is compliant on that. Or the media is willing to maybe not report on US military actions because the government wants to keep it classified or not release information about it. So the media is a bit more willing to work on the government on foreign policy news than maybe domestic news. Bennett talks about the indexing hypothesis. So foreign news coverage usually follows the government line until respected sources begin to dissent. Basically, if political elites are all in favor of a foreign policy, media tends to go along with it. So in his case, he's talking about the Iraq War. In the build-up to the Iraq War, there usually wasn't a lot of dissent from political elites. So the media favored the narrative of building up to war in Iraq. Once dissent occurs, however, once you start seeing the parties, for example, arguing about foreign policy, the media will then become more critical. So Robert Entman's cascade model, coming off of that, basically argues that after the Cold War, dissent among elites on foreign policy is the norm. And so consensus is an exception. And so the media will reflect the debate on foreign policy, if maybe generally favoring the presidential line, assuming the president and media have good relations. Then you have this argument about what's called the CNN effect, which has argued that graphic media coverage of events can push the U.S. to engage in unplanned interventions. So say coverage of atrocities committed in Syria, chemical attacks, a good example, might push for people to push the U.S. government to intervene in a situation the government doesn't want to. Research on this suggests that this might be more influential in encouraging humanitarian interventions. So reports on the devastation of an earthquake in Haiti, for example, might push the U.S. to send support to Haiti. It doesn't seem that media coverage of atrocities can commit the U.S. to military intervention because the cost of military intervention is so high. So argument on the CNN effect seems to suggest it's much more limited than the original argument claims. And then finally, one concern is that the 24 news hour cycle and the need for information as fast as possible means that the government doesn't have as much time to sit and think about their policy before they react. An event happens, we need a government statement as soon as possible. Otherwise, media starts to maybe freak out, people start to get panicked. So at the very least, elites believe that the president and government needs to respond as fast as possible, which leaves less time to sit down and critically think about options. So there's that concern. And that overall finishes our coverage of the media's relationship between various institutions and how the media covers state, local, and foreign news. So that is the end of this week's lecture. Don't forget to do your quiz and to do your discussion paper, and I'll see you next week.